All right, so we are beginning a new series today called Vacation Land. What does vacation mean for you? Rest? How many of you, when you think of vacation, you think of rest? Really? All right. How many of you have forgotten how to go on vacation, right? Like COVID just blew up everything, didn't it? How many of you, for you, vacation is about activity? Like you're on my team, right? Activity, love to do things. We haven't been there in a number of years, but we went to Disney World several times as a family. And I personally measure the success of vacation by the amount of fun you have per dollar spent. And so if you go to Disney World with Josh, it's not restful. We're the first to get there. We hit as many rides as we possibly can, and we shut the park down every day. I know that's not vacation for a lot of you, right? So some are kind of oriented toward the idea of rest, some toward more activity, perhaps. For most of us, it's actually a balance of both things. Now, what is the difference between a vacation you plan for and a vacation that happens to you? And you ever have one of those vacations that happens to you? Like you work in a place where you have so much vacation time, you can't actually even use it all. Right? Some people in here are like, what? There is such a place? Yeah, I mean, I've heard people talk about they're coming near to the end of the year, either the calendar year or their employee year, and they have to use up their vacation. And so they didn't make any particular plans for it, so vacation just kind of happens to them. Those are two very different kinds of vacations, aren't they? Right? The vacation that you plan for, the vacation that you do research and make all of these plans to figure out, how we're going to get there and what we're going to do and what order are we going to do those things, right? Very big difference between that and just the vacation that happens to you. A good vacation, like a really good vacation that is productive in the sense that vacation is to be productive in our lives, often requires some degree of intentionality, right? Like regardless of how easy or difficult, how simple or how intricate the vacation plans may be, they generally require some degree of intentionality, some degree of planning, participating, obviously, pivoting. How many of you ever had to pivot? Like you were on National Lampoon style vacation, right? You had all these great plans, but the plans went awry, right? And you had to pivot, right? Sometimes our vacations require us to do that as well. And so for the next several weeks, we're going to talk about what it means to think about and care for our souls. Like, what does it mean to live and exist as a healthy, soulful being? Because caring for our souls requires a lot of the same things that a good vacation requires. Right? Like you can try to let something like soul care just happen to you, but you're probably going to find that there isn't a lot of success with that particular strategy. That it does actually require some degree of intentionality, right? I have to be intentional about caring for my soul. It requires planning, right? I have to plan out certain things. I have to make decisions about what I'll do and what I won't do in order to actually care for my soul or allow my soul to be cared for. I have to participate in those things that I've planned for, right? So it's one thing to plan for them, another thing entirely to execute them. How many of you ever planned for a vacation and then you just didn't go? Oh, we wouldn't do that, right? That'd be silly, right? Unless we had to, unless we were forced into that kind of situation. But that's very, very unfortunate. Right? So you plan for the vacation, you execute it. In the same way, we have to plan for soul care. We have to participate in it. Oftentimes, we have to pivot. Like we can feel like we're on the best track, for ensuring the health of our souls, but then all of a sudden, life happens to us, and a kind of life that we weren't expecting, a kind of life that was a real curveball. How do we pivot? How do we react? How do we actually endure through that kind of thing? So what is the soul? Like, what do you think about when you think about soul? Some of you think about a style of music, right? What is the soul? Well, the soul, really represents the individuals that each you and I are, right? You are a soul. I'm a soul. The very early parts of your Bible, in that first part of Genesis, when it's described how God created our world and the universe, there's a part where he says that out of the dust of the earth, he formed the first man, and he breathed into him the breath of life, and he became a living soul. The soul we can often think about as that part of us that is comprised of our mind, our will, and our emotions. It is, to a large degree, that immaterial part of us that people can't touch or see in and of itself. When you think about the mind, right, what separates you and me from the rest of creation, you think about the inanimate parts of creation like plants, shrubs, trees, things like that. You think about even those members of the animal kingdom that obviously have a kind of life that is different from the more inanimate parts of creation. What distinguishes the human being from the rest of the beings are such things as our minds. Our minds have the capacity for reasoning, right? Like, we have the ability to rationalize, that is, to consider the input of various streams of consciousness and understand them from a rational perspective. We can reason about them. We can engage things that are input into our lives and determine the level of truth or fallibility with those things. We have the ability to reflect on the past, right? We're talking about things that differentiate us from the rest of natural creation. Regardless of how personable your pet may be to you, and how much that pet may reflect some understanding of the past. That is, if you have ever trained a dog, you know that that dog learns certain behaviors, right, that are built on a foundation of what it has been taught in the past. But what a dog doesn't have the ability to do, this might come as a shock to some of you real dog lovers out there, is a dog can't reflect on the past. Like, it can't reflect on it, right? It doesn't have the capacity to consider the memories of the past like you and I do. We just recently celebrated Memorial Day, right? And some of you, for that particular holiday, there carries some significant memories that, on that weekend especially, you're thought to deliberate on. So we reflect on the past. We also contemplate the future. Now, there's squirrels out there, right, gathering nuts over the course of the harvest season, preparing, right, because by instinct, this animal knows that that's what it's supposed to do, right? And so it gathers its nuts, but you don't have to be driving along for very long in your life to discover that squirrels are pretty poor at contemplating the future, right? They don't look both ways before crossing the street. No, they dart out onto the street, and then they react to the car that's about to hit them, right? So animals, they don't possess the capacity to contemplate the future, but we do, right? Our minds have been created in such a way that we can have such things, such experiences as hope. Animals don't hope for anything, but you do, and I do, right? That's our soul. That's an expression of our souls, to hope, to dream, to aspire, right? Have you ever aspired to something? I want to do that. I want to be that, right? Where does that aspiration come? Well, it comes from the way in which you and I were created. It is a special gift that God has given to us. We have the ability to plan and to purpose for ourselves, right? So that's our mind. We also have, as a part or a dimension of our being, something called the will, right? Those of you who are parents, at times you wished there wasn't such a thing as the will, right? The will of your children, when your children's will is expressing itself in a way that is contrary to the way you want that will to be expressed. But we all as individuals, we have the will. That is, we have the ability to consider multiple options and choose one over the other, right? We can, if we're using the imagery of a journey, we can be walking down a path that forks, and we can consider which of those paths we're going to take, which of those options we're going to choose. Now, interestingly, as human beings, sometimes choosing means choosing what is best for you, right? We do that all the time, right? Facing the options, we say, well, this is the best thing for me, and so I'm going to choose to do that because it's in my best interest. Most animals, most of the time, will do that, right? They will express a will that chooses just simply what nature has kind of driven it to choose. But we can also choose to do something that isn't in our best interest. You think about the person who rushes in to a building that's on fire to save people. Where does that come from, right? That comes from an act of will that says, I'm going to put my own self-interest aside and instead act for the benefit of others. That's a choice. We can choose between what is easy, and again, we often do, right? Given the options, here's the easier thing for me to do. Here's the easiest thing for me. But we also have the freedom to choose sometimes the more difficult path, right? We have the ability to look and see that the more difficult choice, while in the short term seems like it's going to be harder, more laborious, more painful, laced with more sorrow. Like, we understand that to follow that path is a choice that in the long run is better. We can, as an expression of our will, we can give in to what are those regular, basic desires that we have as human beings. Some of those desires may be foolish, or sometimes we can choose to do the more difficult thing. That is to suppress the desire that we feel as an expression of a better choice. Shana said something about our meals on Wednesday nights and a salad if you're into that kind of thing. Right, so we serve pizza, pasta, and salad. Right, people choose what they want to eat. Generally, most dietitians would say the salad is the better choice. Although I just, in the last week or two, discovered that my salads, because of the amount of Italian dressing that I pour onto them, is essentially no different from eating pizza. So it's all good. But you know what I mean? Like, presented with the options to either eat this or eat that. Well, do I want to eat the thing that I'm craving? Like, that looks delicious, yet it's terribly, terribly unhealthy for me. May even make me feel badly afterward, but if it tastes so good going down, right? Like, do I do that, or, and none of us would do this, but do I choose the Brussels sprouts and the asparagus? Now, I know some of you would actually choose that. Some of the other desires we have, like the base desires that we have for for relationships, for intimacy, right? Like the choices that we have with regard to all of these desires that God has given to us as gifts. What do we do with them? Well, our will allows us to choose how we are going to actually express ourselves according to those desires. And then finally, our emotions, right? Our emotions are a part of who we are. They're part of our makeup. God has given us the capacity to feel all the feelings. Last summer, I think it was, but last year, we did a whole series on the 8 feelings of the heart, right? All the feels. Hurt, loneliness, sadness, anger, fear, shame, guilt, and gladness. We talked about how each of these feelings are actually gifts that God has given to us to experience full life. So our soul is expressed outwardly toward others in, to a large degree, in our personality. Now, I look around here, and what I see is I see a bunch of different physical beings. Like, I can differentiate one person from another based on your appearance, right? Like, I can assign names to many of you because I recognize you, right? And who you are. So there are obviously physical differences that we have, but there are also differences in our personalities. You ever recognize somebody without seeing them, but you heard their voice? You ever recognize somebody who they were a far way off and you weren't actually able to discern who they were because they were too far away for the picture to be clear, but something about the cadence of their walk or the way they stood, it was familiar to you and you know who that was? My kids laugh and joke about how easy it is to pick me out of a crowd, right? Because I'm always walking like this. Yeah, thank you. My oldest daughter says I'm going to be a really cute old man someday, though. So I've got that going for me. So the soul can encompass the whole person, right? Like, while we oftentimes think about the immaterial part of us, the reality is, as human beings, we are whole beings. We are not just our soul, nor are we just our bodies, nor are we just our spirit. You as a human being, you are comprised of all 3 of these things: spirit, soul, and body. And what we often do is we often pay attention to one part of us, but often to the exclusion of the other parts. And whenever we do that, whenever we neglect one part of the beings that we are, we undoubtedly affect the other parts of us. Now, you know that. If the condition of my soul is unhealthy, how many of you know that affects the physical part of you? Right? We've known this for a long time, that a lot of times the sicknesses that come upon us or the other physical ailments that come upon us, they're not purely physical. They're actually derived from the immaterial part of us that are contributing to it. Right? It is an unhealthy soul that is contributing to an unhealthy body, and vice versa. You don't take care of your bodies, there's a really good chance that is going to have some bearing or effect on your soul and your spirit. How many of you, when you're really, really, really tired, you're at your best? Right? You're the person people want to be around. When you're tired and hungry, right? We made a name for that, didn't we? That's right. I'm hangry. Oh, hangry people. They're wonderful, aren't they? Right? If you don't take care of the physical parts of you, then the immaterial parts of you are also going to suffer, right? So we are whole beings. And we happen to live in a time that is not wholly unique from the rest of human history, but we are becoming more and more acutely aware. If you're paying attention, we are becoming more acutely aware of how there is this tendency to separate and to differentiate these three aspects of who we are and to minimize one or more parts of them. Now, it is no secret, of course, that the spiritual part of us, right, that is, God created me with spirit. That is the immaterial and eternal part of me that gives me the capacity to be in communion with God. If it weren't for the spirit that I possess, I would not have the ability to have a relationship with God because God is spirit. And clearly in our world, there's been, in many ways and for many people, a wholesale reduction of the importance of our spiritual health. What difference does it make? The condition of your relationship with God. What difference does it make? Well, that's a really good question, but I would just propose that it makes a difference. And if my soul, if my body are not being properly cared for, if I'm not doing with my body what I ought to be doing, if I'm not doing with my soul what I ought to be doing, then there's a really good chance that's going to affect my relationship with God, right? It's going to affect my spiritual part, right? So anyway, the point is all these things play into the health for who we are. And if I could this morning, I just want to read a few verses and talk a little bit about these. And these are really kind of a vision for the series that I believe comes from Jesus himself. Matthew chapter 11, starting in verse 28. This is going to sound very familiar to many of you. Some of you have even memorized these few verses. Listen to what Jesus says. Matthew chapter 11, verse 28. Come to me, all of you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. How many of you, don't raise your hands, but how many of you would say, I'm weary and burdened? Right, Jesus says, come to me and I will give you rest. Take up my yoke and learn from me because I am lowly and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. The first thing I want to point out as we think about what it means to experience care for our souls, right? To engage ourselves in something like soul care. Just listen to what Jesus expresses in this invitation. He says, come unto me. Come to me. Now, the imagery we often hear when it comes to like being in a relationship with Jesus is the command to what? What do we do with Jesus? We follow him, right? Follow Jesus, right? Over and over again in the Gospels, Jesus looked at somebody and said, come and follow me, right? There's this imagery of a journey that's being taken, right? And Jesus is the leader of that journey, and he's inviting people to follow him. That's very, very important imagery for us. But at the same time, there are perhaps people in this room right now where your soul is in such a place that the idea of following Jesus is something you're not even ready to accommodate. Imagine if you have been walking all night and all day and all night again without rest, without sleep, without proper nourishment. But on and on the journey goes. And you have come to the end of that, and you can go no more, and somebody says, we've got to keep going. And you just don't have it in you. Like, the reality is that for a lot of people, their experience in life and the circumstances that they're facing has put them in a place where they feel like that. So while we oftentimes hear and understand, like, well, to be a disciple of Jesus means to be a follower of Jesus. It's just very interesting what Jesus invites us to here. What does he say? He says, come to me. Come to me. That is that Jesus is the ultimate end in himself. Right? We think about the Christian life as being a journey of following Jesus, and it is. But let's not forget that the life of the Christian ultimately finds its end in Jesus himself. Jesus is the end. Come to me. The last thing a tired person or somebody that's carrying a heavy load wants to hear is now keep on walking. Right? It's the difference between toiling around all the tasks involved in preparing for some extravagant meal, right? That you're expecting company, right? And so all day, yesterday, you were busy preparing the foods that you're going to serve the next day. And then you get up early in the morning, right? And the stove and the ovens are fired up, right? And the cooking begins, right? And added to all the preparation of yesterday is the hustle and bustle of today, because today's the big day. And here they come, right? The house has been made ready, the table has been set, the food is cooking and about to be served. There's a lot of toil, there's a lot of work that goes into that. And there's a stark difference between that kind of an experience and the one where you just simply walk in to a place where a meal has been prepared in your honor. I love going to my mom's house for holiday, Thanksgiving or Christmas, because she and her husband Gary, they're fabulous cooks, and they prepare this wonderful meal that, like, when I walk in, I feel like they make you feel like this was done in your honor. And it's really something. And I barely lifted a finger, if at all. I mean, I had to drive a long way, but when I got there, right, the meal, the gathering around the table was an end of itself. There's nothing more for me to do. And so Jesus seems to be inviting us into that kind of an experience. He's the end. So let's not forget that. He says in his invitation, he opens it to all of you. All of you. It is undoubtedly in Jesus' mind, when he talks about all of you in this invitation, that he is thinking primarily of those who have been otherwise dismissed, those who have been forgotten, those who have been rejected, those who have found no other place in which they belong, those that don't measure up to the expectations of others, those that don't live up to the regulations that the institutions of their particular world have established. And so they find themselves with no place. And Jesus, in his invitation, says, all of you, come to me. He describes these people as weary and burdened. This word weary describes a person who is suffering the effects of long toil, of hard work, right? We've all engaged in hard work from time to time. Think about the feeling that you have at the end of having accomplished that hard work. Like, how does your body feel? Especially if the project isn't finished, right? You know you're going back to it the next day, and you go home and you're tired. Your feet hurt. Other parts of your body are in distress. You just fall on the couch or on your bed without the ability to do another thing, right? This is the effect of weariness. And Jesus recognizes that for many of us, this is what life has given us. It has created a weariness for our souls, right? That living in this world and living among other people can be difficult. It can be hard. He describes them as burdened. In another place, Jesus uses this word as an accusation against the religious institution of his day, which was really this political and religious institution combined together that made it practically impossible for the ordinary person to live their lives with any sense of fulfillment or happiness or contentment. It would be like, being in an academic setting, right? Like being in school where the reading assignments and the homework mounted up to something that was beyond your physical ability or the time that you had to actually get it done. Or that the tests that were given were impossible to pass. Or that you worked at a place where there was a daily quota that was beyond practicable and perhaps even impossible to meet. And the burden grew every day. Like, a person that's experienced, some financial hardship that already created a sense of distress, but then instead of over the next month things getting better, the bottom line just kept getting worse and worse and worse. Or, and many of you will identify with this, the feeling of not being able to live up to all of the demands that are presently upon us. How many of you would say there are more demands represented by the various areas of my life that I can actually satisfy? For me to come through on one demand that is being made of me necessarily means I'm going to disappoint somebody or something else, right? Isn't that the state we so oftentimes find ourselves constantly trying to survive through? So Jesus says, all of you who are weary and burdened, come to me, and here's the promise, and I will give you rest. So how does Jesus give us rest? Is he going to do my homework? When I sit down and take the test, is he going to whisper the answers into my ear? Is he going to meet my quota at work? Is he going to pay my bills? Is he going to take some stuff off my plate? Like, what does this mean? He says, I will give you rest. Now, we have to understand something about us as human beings. This is very, very, very important. We have to understand that in our rebellion, right? And our rebellion is universal. Our rebellion initially is described by the choice that the first man and woman created in this world made to rebel against God, to go against God's will. But the reality is that from that time until this present day, you and I have participated in a universal rebellion against God. And in that rebellion, you and I lost a sense of what we were created for. Eternal meaning, eternal purpose, something that's bigger than ourselves. And so from that moment until right now, you and I have been striving to regain it. We have been toiling to regain that eternal meaning, that eternal purpose, that sense that there's something bigger than ourselves. We strive, think about it, we strive for the material things that we need or want, right? We work hard for those things at varying levels. Some of us work really, really, really hard just to meet the basic necessities of our lives. And some of us have to work less hard to meet the basic necessities of our lives. But we strive for those material things that we need, and we also strive for the immaterial things that we need, or we lose heart and we just give up. But in the end, the result is the same. That what we were created for remains just outside of our grasp. We quite, as much as we try to fulfill and satisfy the desires that have been born, that are innate to our being, that are part of the essence of who we are, they remain just outside of our grasp. And we fool ourselves into thinking that we have gotten it, right? And we've gotten our hands wrapped around it, and we hold on to it as tight as we can. Renee and I we drove out to Portland for dinner last night. And on the way there was a jet ski for sale on the side of the road. You know how much I want a jet ski? Quite a bit. Although I'd be just as happy to be friends with somebody who owns a jet ski. Right? And then when we're driving back, I was like, oh, there it is again. There's that jet ski. Right? So, If the thrill of riding on a jet ski is one of those things that contributes to my feeling like, oh, life is awesome. And come on, let's be honest. How could life not be awesome while you're riding on a jet ski, right? But if it's about that, if it's about the thrills, if it's about the experiences, if it's about the next great thing that I bought, that I've added to the horde of other things that I got to try to make me feel fulfilled and satisfied. If it's, well, this relationship didn't work out, so now I'm going to run to that relationship. Or this relationship isn't quite going the way that I want, and so I'm going to compromise certain principles of my life in order to get what I want out of the next relationship. Right? So there we are, constantly reaching, constantly grasping, but all the while, it's just out of reach. And so Jesus, when he says and invites us into his rest, he actually asks us to do something. He says, take my yoke and learn from me. Take up my yoke. A lot of times we think about rest as being something similar to nothingness. Well, rest means a nap, right? Rest means entering into a state of unconsciousness so that my body is no longer being asked to do another thing. My mind is not being asked to think about another thing, right? Like we make equivalent the idea of rest to those kinds of things. But Jesus, he says, in this rest that he invites us to, he asks us to do something. And he says, take up my yoke. So Jesus isn't inviting us to find simple nothingness or emptiness. He says, take up my yoke. So, is this just another substitute religion? Is this a substitute for either the lack of religion in my life or for the particular religious expression of my life currently? Well, yes and no. You think about a yoke. Remember from the previous verse, the weariness that comes with the labor of living, that we're all carrying a yoke like any beast of burden. The problem is that most of us, most of the time, are walking around with a yoke that isn't properly fitted for us. And we're carrying a load that is beyond our capacity to pull. See, what Jesus isn't doing is he isn't inviting us into the state of nothingness, right? Like, some people would express a desire to enter into nirvana. You ever heard of nirvana? This idea that, we all have desires, and the problem with our experience in this world is that those desires oftentimes go unmet, and because of that, we experience suffering. And so nirvana is the state that we are all aspiring ultimately to get to, where there is no more desire for anything, and therefore no more suffering. There's no more individual consciousness. All the anxiety and everything goes away because we just enter into this state of nothingness. And that nothingness is thought to be real bliss and happiness. I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound happy and blissful at all to me. And that's not what Jesus is inviting us into. It's not no yoke, but rather the yoke of Jesus is an alternative to the yoke that you're already bearing. You're already carrying a load. You're already yoked with something. And what Jesus is inviting us to is to take a yoke that is, in fact, an alternative to the one that we're already trudging around with. He says, take my yoke and learn from me because I am lowly and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls, right? The subtitle of our series, Vacation Land. Find rest for your souls. This is a part of the promise that Jesus makes to us. By taking up his yoke and learning from him, we will find rest for our souls. Jesus comes from a position that you and I are wholly unaccustomed to. Think about what influences you. Think about who influences you, right? All around you, there are screens. There are screens in your pockets or your pocketbooks. There are screens all around your home. And those screens were designed to discern the input, what you look at, what you search. I have been told in the conspiracy theory of all things, it's even listening to the conversations that we have. And because I said the word jet ski, guess what advertisements I'm going to experience the next time I'm on the internet, right? So all these screens around us, they have been designed to entice us to buy something. Famous people, influential people, entice you to buy the shoe that they're wearing, or the car that they're driving, or the goop that they're putting on their faces or into their bodies. We've even created a whole new kind of career, right? The career of the influencer. I'm sorry if there's any aspiring influencers here this morning, right? But these influencers, they're leveraging the desires of others to make a living for themselves. Now, the question is this: is that influencer truly motivated by an interest in you and what is best for you, or are they motivated by an interest in themselves? Jesus says, learn from me because I am lowly and humble in heart. Jesus comes from a position that we are just wholly unaccustomed to. The reality is you and I, we have people swirling all around us, systems all around us, institutions all around us that are trying to manipulate and take advantage of our behaviors, our desires, and our wants to make a buck, to increase their influence, to expand their power. And what do? Well, we just, like lemmings, we follow in suit. But Jesus, he brings a whole new kind of influence. He says, I'm lowly. That is, he's meek. Meekness has to do with a well-regulated temper. It's a freedom from self-importance and a concern for one's own interests, but rather a greater concern for the interest of others. And this is what Jesus says regarding his way. I am meek. Jesus did not consider himself, and let's not forget, we're talking about the God and the creator of the universe. He submitted himself to become like one of us because he didn't put his self-interests ahead of ours. If he had, then he would have rescued himself when he was threatened. If he had, he wouldn't have suffered. If he had, he wouldn't have died on the cross. He says, I am humble. Not a lot of humility out there. A lot of pretend humility, but not a lot of true, authentic humility. But this is exactly how Jesus describes himself. To be humble means that he is a person of low stature, somebody who is undistinguished. Now, I think this, and you probably think this is just crazy. Like Jesus, undistinguished? Yeah, in a lot of ways, Jesus was undistinguished. And he says, learn this from him. Learn what it means to be meek, to be lowly, to be humble of heart. You know, much of our modern, Western kind of Christian experience, especially the forms that have made really, really tight political allegiances to one side of the aisle or the other, they pine to operate from a place of power and political cachet. But true Christianity, listen, true Christianity isn't in league with this world. It isn't. True Christianity is not a partner to this world or to its systems or to its governments. It's just not. We want it to be because we all want to operate from a place of influence. We all want to operate from a place of power because, well, that's a much easier way. That's a much better way to be able to to compel others to do what you want them to do. But true, authentic Christianity operates from the margins. It did when Jesus was around. It did in the apostolic age. And while for many of us, the experience of Christianity in our world has oftentimes come from a position of power and influence, that is not the essence of true Christianity. True Christianity operates regardless of what is its stature in the world. That is, it can exist and it can thrive even in the most hostile of environments. When whole communities have risen up against it, when governments have tried to abolish it, when legislators have tried to outlaw it, Christianity can thrive. Because Christianity is not subject to the powers of this world. To try to do otherwise is to take a yoke that we weren't designed for. And Jesus says, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Again, we're not talking about no yoke. We're not talking about no burden. We're talking about the yoke that Jesus offers and the burden that he provides. Jesus, unlike everyone and everything else in our world, isn't trying to sell you something. Not another gadget or gizmo or modern convenience or the next must-have or an upgrade to what you already have. He's not offering a way to work smarter, not harder, or to give you the next sure thing, or to give you a free ride, or get you onto some get-rich-quick scheme. He's not there to offer you the fountain of youth, a risk-free trial, or 3 easy payments. He's offering you a whole alternative to what you and I already have. My yoke is easy. It isn't no yoke. It's just a yoke that has been properly fitted to you, and a yoke that has been properly fitted to me. You know, an ox wants to work. You know, when they yoke up a workhorse, that horse wants to work. It wants to pull a load. You know, some people might say, oh, that's abusive to treat an animal like that way. No, the animal wants to do that because it was designed for it. And you and I, we were not designed to exist yokeless or burdenless as much as we might wish that were the case. What we were designed for is to be yoked with what has been properly fitted and customized for us. He says, my burden is light. Again, it isn't no burden, but it's a burden that's just right for you. Remember the story of Goldilocks and the 3 bears, right? You had one who said, this bed is too hard, one who said, this bed is too soft, and then, of course, little baby bear who said, this bed is just right. Jesus offers a yoke and a load that's just right for us. And so what I want for us to experience over our next weeks together as we go through these various things that contribute to the betterment of our whole selves, I want for us to understand this one very, very important thing, and that is that yours is a soul that God loves and God cares about. That your soul, the essence and the being of who you are, is of incredible, indescribable, and unlimited importance to God because he loves you and he cares about you. He cares about the weariness. He cares about the load. He cares about the burden. He cares about whatever it is that is currently creating distress and difficulty in your life that is making you something less than the whole person he wants you to be. So I just invite you over our next weeks together to consider very, very deeply, God, what do you want? What do you have for me? What is there for me in this? God, you recognize where are my points of pain, my points of struggle, my points of difficulty. God, would you help me? I hope that many of us will be arrested right where we are and be ready to bow our knees to him and take his yoke and his burden, because his yoke is easy and his burden is light.